My name is, well, for the sake of this story, you can just call me Brooklyn born, late 30s. The kind of woman people assume will handle it. I've lived in the same few neighborhoods long enough to be mistaken for someone louder, tougher, and more confrontational than I actually am. I work in a role that looks supportive from the outside, reliable, steady, the person who keeps things moving without needing credit. Most people, when they meet me, think I'm agreeable. They think I'm calm because nothing rattles me, not because I've learned how to watch carefully before I speak. They assume my silence is softness, or fear, or a lack of ambition. I've never corrected that assumption. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about exposing villains or painting myself as a hero. It's about something quieter than that. How power shifts when you stop explaining yourself, and how integrity can look invisible right up until it isn't. What I'm going to share unfolded over years, not days. There were no dramatic confrontations, no raised voices, no sudden victories, just a sequence of small decisions that eventually became irreversible. It's a story about work, yes, but more than that, it's about identity. About what happens when the version of you others rely on no longer matches the one you've become. At the center of it is a moment that, on paper, looks administrative: a resignation, an email, a date, the kind of thing companies process every day without emotion. But behind that moment was a long accumulation of being overlooked, subtly corrected, quietly displaced. And a realization that staying silent doesn't always mean staying passive. I want to be clear about something up front. I'm not telling this to stir outrage or to invite sides. I'm telling it because there's a specific kind of injustice that doesn't announce itself. It happens politely. It hides behind process and procedure. And if you've ever felt it, you know how disorienting it can be to question your own memory, your own worth, while everyone else insists nothing is wrong. As you listen, you won't hear me claim perfection. I made compromises. I stayed quiet longer than I should have. I benefited from stability even as it slowly eroded my sense of self. This is not a story about being blameless. It's a story about being awake. If you stay with me, you'll hear how I went from being essential but invisible to becoming someone whose absence couldn't be easily explained away. Not through force, not through drama, just through clarity, timing, and restraint. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. No need to answer out loud. Have you ever looked back at a moment in your life and realized you were being reshaped without your consent, simply because you were easy to rely on? I didn't join the company with ambition blazing out of my eyes. I joined the way a lot of women like me do: competent, cautious, grateful for stability. I'd already learned that workplaces don't reward potential as much as they reward consistency. So I led with that. I became consistent. From the beginning, I was useful. Not flashy, not charismatic in meetings, but the person who remembered what was decided 3 weeks ago. The person who caught contradictions before they became problems. The person managers leaned on when something needed to be handled quietly. Over time, I noticed how I was introduced. This is Maya. She keeps us all sane. Maya knows where everything is. If anyone can fix it, Maya can. They said it with affection, with relief. And that was the problem. Affection is not authority. Relief is not respect. In meetings, my role was rarely strategic. I wasn't asked what we should do, only how to do it once someone else had decided. I was looped in late, then expected to execute perfectly. When I raised questions, they were reframed as concerns. When I proposed alternatives, they were treated as logistics, not vision. I told myself this was fine. I told myself visibility was overrated. I had a work-life balance. I had trust. I had autonomy, at least in the narrow lane they'd assigned me. What I didn't have was authorship. If something went well, it was the team. If something went wrong, it was operations. And operations quietly was me. I don't say that with bitterness. At the time, I wore it like a badge. Being invisible meant being safe. It meant not being targeted when leadership shifted or budgets tightened. I had watched louder people burn out or get managed out. I learned early that the company rewarded people who didn't make trouble. So I became someone they could rely on without worrying about. That's a dangerous category to fall into. I noticed it most clearly in performance reviews. My feedback was always positive, always vague. Dependable, steady, a backbone. There were no concrete paths forward, no discussions of growth that didn't dissolve into maybe next cycle. When I asked what skills I should develop to move up, the answers were soft, non answers. You're already doing so much. We don't want to lose you where you are. It sounded like appreciation. It was actually containment. Still, I stayed. I told myself I was choosing patience. I told myself the work mattered more than the title. And maybe part of me believed that. But another part, the quieter, more observant part, was cataloging patterns. Who spoke and who was echoed, who was interrupted and who wasn't, whose mistakes became learning moments and whose became footnotes. I watched new hires surpass me in visibility within months, buoyed by confidence and novelty. I trained them, I supported them, I cleaned up after them, and I smiled when they were praised for ideas I'd floated years earlier in slightly different words. This wasn't cruelty. That's important to say. No one was openly unkind. No one set out to diminish me. It was something more insidious. I fit too well into the background. I made other people's jobs easier without demanding space of my own. And organizations, like people, will take what you offer without asking if it costs you something. At the time, I didn't think of myself as invisible. I thought of myself as essential. And there's a comfort in that illusion. Essential people believe they are protected. They believe their value is obvious. They believe someone, somewhere is keeping track. I didn't yet understand how replaceable essential becomes once it's taken for granted. Looking back now, I can see that this was the role I played perfectly. Reliable, reasonable, quietly absorbing pressure so others didn't have to. I didn't challenge narratives. I didn't demand clarity. I didn't insist on recognition. Not because I was afraid, because I thought this was the smartest way to survive. What I didn't realize, what I couldn't yet see, was that survival and self-erasure can look almost identical from the inside. The first time I noticed something was wrong, it didn't feel important enough to name. That's how these things begin. Not as alarms, but as static, easy to ignore, easier to explain away. It happened in a meeting I wasn't supposed to attend, a last-minute invite forwarded by someone who couldn't make it, and said, "You'll know what to say if they ask." That alone should have told me something. I was trusted with answers, not with presence. The meeting was about a restructuring, minor they said, a reshuffling of responsibilities to streamline workflows. I listened as people spoke confidently about processes I had built, systems I maintained, decisions I'd made in isolation because no one else wanted to be bothered with them. My name wasn't mentioned once. At one point, a senior manager explained a risk I had flagged months earlier, almost word for word. I watched heads nod around the table. Someone said, "Good catch." Not to me, to him. I felt it then, a brief, sharp awareness. Not anger, not humiliation, just recognition. This is how it happens. I could have spoken up. It would have been easy. A simple, "Yes, that's something I've been tracking." A reminder of context. A gentle reclaiming of authorship. I didn't. Not because I froze, because I calculated. I told myself it wasn't worth derailing the conversation. That I didn't need credit to know the truth. That being seen as cooperative mattered more than being seen as right. And for a while, that logic held. After the meeting, the same manager thanked me privately. "Really helpful insights," he said, as if I'd provided them just now. I nodded. I accepted the compliment. I didn't correct the record. That was the first small cut. Not the meeting itself, but my own decision to minimize it. From the outside, nothing had changed. My role stayed the same. My workload increased slightly. Another process folded under my umbrella. No title adjustment, no conversation, just quiet absorption. I noticed how quickly the story rewrote itself. The risk wasn't something I had identified. It was something we had become aware of. The solution wasn't built from my notes. It was aligned across teams. Language smoothed the edges of reality until individual contributions dissolved completely. I started paying closer attention after that. Not obsessively, just enough to confirm the pattern. Ideas traveled upward without names attached. Decisions flowed downward with expectations attached. When timelines slipped, I was asked what happened. When things succeeded, I was told, "Great teamwork." Again, no one was malicious. That made it harder to object. You can't confront a vibe, you can't escalate an omission. There's no policy for being gradually erased. So I did what people like me often do. I adjusted internally instead of externally. I worked harder. I documented more thoroughly. I made myself even more indispensable, believing, naively, that indispensability would eventually force recognition. It didn't. It did the opposite. The more seamless things became, the less visible my labor was. My manager began speaking on my behalf more often, summarizing my work before I could. In meetings, he'd say, "Maya's got it covered," in a tone that closed the door on further discussion. It sounded protective. It felt diminishing. I told myself I was being sensitive, that I should be grateful for trust, that not everyone needs a spotlight. And that was true, to a point. But there's a difference between choosing privacy and being quietly sidelined. The cut was small, almost invisible, no blood, no witnesses. Just a slight shift in how I saw myself inside the organization. I was no longer a contributor in the room. I was a resource referenced in my absence. And once you're no longer in the room where narratives form, you don't get to decide how you're remembered or replaced. After that first small cut, nothing dramatic followed. That's what made it dangerous. Disrespect rarely announces itself. It settles in quietly, rearranging your expectations until you mistake endurance for maturity. I began to notice how often I was spoken about instead of spoken to. Decisions that affected my workload arrived fully formed, presented as fates accompli. When I asked questions, they were framed as clarifications, not contributions. "You're so detail-oriented," my manager would say, smiling, as if that explained why I wasn't looped in earlier. I started rationalizing everything. I told myself leadership had bigger things to worry about, that my value lies in execution, not ideation, that being trusted to handle complexity was its own form of respect. And for a while, that story worked. But then the patterns repeated, over and over. I'd flag a concern in writing, carefully, with supporting data. Weeks later, the same concern would surface in a meeting, reframed as a sudden insight. I'd be asked afterward why I hadn't mentioned it sooner. I learned to forward emails to myself, just in case. Not to accuse, just to remember. Meetings became performances. I wasn't cast in. I'd sit quietly while others debated strategy around systems I knew intimately. Occasionally, someone would glance at me for confirmation. I'd nod. The discussion would continue without my voice. I told myself this was diplomacy. Speaking less made my words carry more weight when I did speak. But the truth was simpler. My silence had become expected. The line between being patient and being disregarded blurred. And once it blurs, it's easy to cross without noticing. I noticed it in how feedback changed. Early on, I was praised for initiative. Later, I was praised for reliability. There's nothing wrong with being reliable until that's all you're allowed to be. New responsibilities appeared without conversation. "We assumed you'd be fine with this." Deadlines tightened. Resources didn't. When I pushed back gently, I was told, "You always make it work." That sentence landed differently every time. At first, it sounded like trust. Then it sounded like an expectation. Eventually, it sounded like entitlement. I normalized it because everyone else did. Colleagues joked about being stretched thin. Burnout was worn like a badge. Complaining was seen as a weakness. And I didn't want to be the difficult one. So I adapted. I made myself smaller in meetings, sharper in preparation. I anticipated needs before they were articulated. I absorbed ambiguity so others wouldn't have to. And the more I did that, the more the organization adjusted around my silence. My absence from key discussions became routine. My presence became functional, not influential. I remember one moment clearly. A junior colleague, someone I had mentored, presented a process improvement. It was a simplified version of something I'd designed years earlier. Afterward, she thanked me for inspiring her. Leadership praised her initiative. No one mentioned my involvement. I smiled. I congratulated her. I meant it. But something inside me went very still. That was when I realized I had helped build a system where my own contributions could be cleanly extracted and redistributed, not stolen, repurposed, sanitized of authorship. And I had allowed it, step, by choosing harmony over clarity. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from being perpetually reasonable, from explaining away your own discomfort so others don't have to feel accountable. I was tired, but not in a way that sleep could fix. Still, I stayed quiet. I told myself this was just how organizations worked, that pushing back would make me seem emotional, that timing mattered. And this wasn't the time. What I didn't yet understand was that by normalizing disrespect, I was training everyone around me on how little explanation I required. And once people learn that, they rarely unlearn it on their own. By the time I fully understood the role I'd been assigned, it had already hardened into expectation. Not on paper, no job description ever changed, but in the collective imagination of the people around me. I was the constant, the one who would stay late without being asked, the one who could translate chaos into order, the one who didn't need much guidance and didn't ask for much in return. In their minds, I wasn't someone who needed managing. I was someone who made management easier. That distinction mattered more than I realized. In meetings, my manager would speak with authority about operational realities, confident because he knew I would make whatever he promised come true. I became the safety net beneath decisions I hadn't helped shape. If something felt unrealistic, I adjusted privately. If timelines were aggressive, I reworked processes quietly. If expectations were unclear, I filled in the gaps myself. From the outside, this looked like competence. From the inside, it felt like containment. I wasn't asked if I wanted more responsibility. It was assumed. I wasn't asked if I wanted visibility. It was decided that I didn't. When opportunities arose that could have expanded my role, they were discussed without me. Later I'd hear, "We didn't think you'd be interested." Interested, as if ambition only counts when it's loud. I started noticing how often my name was paired with adjectives instead of authority. Reliable, supportive, low maintenance. Those words sound flattering until you realize they're often used to justify exclusion. Low maintenance people don't need to be consulted. Supportive people don't need to lead. Reliable people don't need change. I was invited into conversations when something was broken, not when something was being built. My role was to stabilize, not to innovate. And because I was good at it, that became my ceiling. I didn't fight it, not openly. Part of me believed that if I kept delivering, someone would eventually notice the imbalance. That merit would surface on its own. It's a comforting myth, especially for people raised to believe that effort is always visible. But organizations don't correct imbalances unless they're forced to. Comfort is a powerful anesthetic, and I had made everyone very comfortable. There was also a quieter fear beneath my compliance. If I stopped being this version of myself, would there be anything left? My identity had fused with my usefulness. Saying no felt like risking irrelevance. So I stayed within the lines. I didn't ask for credit. I didn't ask for title changes. I didn't ask for compensation adjustments beyond what was offered. I told myself I was choosing peace. What I was actually choosing was predictability for them. I saw how others navigated differently. Colleagues who negotiated loudly, who framed their work as exceptional even when it wasn't. They were seen as leaders. I was seen as infrastructure. Necessary but not aspirational. And infrastructure, once it's stable, is rarely upgraded. It's only noticed when it fails. That realization sat with me longer than I expected. Not as resentment, but as clarity. I understood then that no one was going to reimagine my role for me. They had already decided who I was in the system. The role I was assigned wasn't written anywhere, but it governed everything. I was the reliable executor, the quiet absorber of risk, the person whose presence reduced friction without ever generating momentum of her own. I had become indispensable in a way that kept me small. At the time, I still believed I could outgrow it from the inside, that patience would eventually be rewarded, that staying reasonable would lead to fairness. But something had already shifted. Once you see the shape of the box you're in, you can't unsee it. And you start to understand that the walls aren't always enforced by others. Sometimes they're reinforced by your own silence. The day something shifted didn't come with an argument or a revelation. There was no email that made my stomach drop. No meeting that ended in silence. It was quieter than that. Almost ordinary. I was on my commute, standing in the familiar press of bodies, half listening to a podcast I'd already heard before. My phone buzzed with a calendar notification. Another meeting added overnight. Same title as the others. Same people. I wasn't surprised to see my name missing from the invite. What surprised me was my reaction. Nothing rose up, no irritation, no internal negotiation. Just a calm, almost clinical awareness. Of course I'm not on it. And then, immediately after, and I don't have to be okay with that anymore. That was the shift. Not emotional, decisional. I attended the meeting anyway. because someone had forwarded it to me at the last minute. I sat in the same chair, opened the same notebook, listened to the same cadence of voices. But something had changed in how I was listening. I wasn't tracking outcomes. I wasn't anticipating follow-ups. I was observing roles. Who deferred to whom? Who summarized whose points? Who was allowed to be vague and who wasn't? When my manager spoke, I noticed how often he used my work as a foundation without naming it. Not maliciously, habitually. He had grown used to the ground being solid beneath him. He didn't look down anymore, and for the first time I didn't feel the urge to make it solid. A question came up about feasibility. All eyes turned briefly in my direction. The pause was subtle, expectant. I could have filled it, I always did. I didn't, not out of spite, out of curiosity. I waited. Someone else answered confidently and incorrectly. The conversation moved on, notes were taken, a decision was made. I felt something loosen in my chest, not relief, permission. Later that afternoon, an issue surfaced, a predictable one. I had flagged it months earlier. I was asked, casually, if I could take a look. I said yes. Of course I did. But I didn't rush. I didn't rearrange my evening. I didn't compensate for someone else's certainty. I approached it at a human pace, not an emergency one. Nothing broke. The world didn't end. That evening, I opened my notebook. Not to vent, not to plan an exit, but to write a single sentence. I am not responsible for protecting people from the consequences of not listening. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a vow. It was a boundary I had never articulated before, even to myself. From that day on, I started noticing how much of my energy had gone into smoothing other people's paths, anticipating questions before they were asked, preventing mistakes before they are visible, translating complexity so others could remain confident. I hadn't been asked to do most of that. I had volunteered because it felt easier than watching things wobble. But watching things wobble taught me something important. My silence didn't weaken me. It clarified me. I began to understand that change doesn't always require confrontation. Sometimes it requires withdrawal, not disappearing, just stepping back far enough to see what actually holds. The shift wasn't dramatic. No one noticed it. That was the point. Inside, though, something fundamental had realigned. I was no longer trying to be indispensable. I was trying to be accurate about my role, my limits, and my worth. And once accuracy becomes more important than approval, your choices start to change quietly, but permanently. After that day, my silence stopped being reflexive. It became intentional, and that changed everything. I still spoke when asked. I still delivered what I committed to. But I stopped volunteering the extra layer, the anticipatory work that had made other people's decisions look smarter than they were. I answered the question that was asked, not the one I knew was coming next. At first, no one noticed. They rarely do when you stop overfunctioning. The absence of excess looks like normalcy to people who benefited from it. Meetings felt different. I listened more than I spoke, but not in the old way. I wasn't waiting for gaps to fill. I was tracking assumptions. When someone made a claim that rested on shaky ground, I let it stand. Not to prove a point, but to see who would own it. They didn't. Instead, decisions piled up on incomplete information. Timelines grew optimistic. Dependencies were glossed over. I documented everything, quietly, in my notebook. Dates, phrasing, who said what and what wasn't said. Not as ammunition as reality. My manager started checking in more frequently. "Everything okay?" he'd ask, tone casual. I said yes, because it was, for the first time in a long while. I wasn't carrying other people's anxiety on my back. He began summarizing more in meetings, filling the space I used to occupy. Sometimes he got it right. Sometimes he didn't. When he didn't, I corrected only what affected my direct responsibilities. Nothing more. Others mistook this restraint for disengagement. I could feel it in the subtle shifts, the way people stopped glancing at me for confirmation, the way my inbox quieted slightly. That silence felt like a test, and I passed it by, not rushing to reassure anyone. There's a particular kind of power in letting people experience the limits of their own understanding, not as punishment, but as information. I wasn't withholding out of malice. I was aligning my output with my role, instead of compensating for its distortions. I noticed something else, too. Without my constant buffering, small frictions surfaced. Meetings ran longer. Follow-ups multiplied. Things that used to feel seamless became just a bit clunky. No one connected that to me. That was the quiet dominance of it. I hadn't announced a change. I hadn't made demands. I had simply stopped being more than I was paid and positioned to be. Internally, I felt steadier, less reactive. I slept better. I wasn't replaying conversations in my head at night wondering what I should have said differently. My words, when I used them, were cleaner. I was choosing silence. Not because I felt small, but because I finally trusted myself enough not to perform. And that trust did something subtle. It made other people uneasy, not overtly, just enough to prompt questions. Do you still enjoy the work? Are you thinking about what's next? Questions that hadn't been asked before, because my presence had always signaled continuity. I answered honestly but minimally. I enjoyed parts of the work. I was always thinking about what's next. Both true, neither explanatory. What they didn't realize was that my silence was no longer a holding pattern. It was a boundary. And boundaries, once established internally, don't require enforcement. They simply change what you're willing to absorb. I wasn't waiting for recognition anymore. I was observing consequences. And in that observation, something else was forming, something they never noticed because it didn't announce itself. Preparation. Not for confrontation, for inevitability. Preparation didn't arrive as a plan. It arrived as a posture. A way of moving through my days that looked exactly like before, same hours, same demeanor, same output, but was governed by a different internal logic. I stopped thinking in terms of fixing and started thinking in terms of recording. Every decision that affected my scope but didn't include me in its formation went into my notebook. Not emotionally, clinically. Dates, attendees, language used. Follow-up actions assigned or not assigned. I wasn't collecting grievances. I was mapping patterns. I noticed how often urgency replaced clarity. How frequently were they implied instead of stated? How decisions were framed as consensus after the fact. These weren't mistakes. They were habits. And habits leave trails. At the same time, I began quietly learning things no one thought I needed to know. Not out of ambition, but out of self-respect. I reviewed policies I'd skimmed years ago. I reread my employment agreement line by line. I familiarized myself with labor regulations, not just the ones HR summarized, but the actual language. It was surprising how much of it I had never been encouraged to read closely. I also started cleaning my digital footprint, organizing files, backing up documentation, making sure timelines were traceable and ownership was clear, not publicly but privately. I wasn't hiding anything. I was making sure nothing could be misrepresented without friction. At work, I became precise. I confirmed conversations in writing. I asked for clarification when instructions were vague, not because I didn't understand, but because ambiguity benefits the person with more power. Precision, I'd learned, protects the person with less. No one objected. In fact, most people appreciated it. They just didn't realize what it added up to. What they never noticed was how I was repositioning myself from participant to witness, from an emotional stakeholder to a factual one. I wasn't invested in outcomes the way I used to be. I was invested in accuracy. There's a freedom in that shift. When you stop trying to be liked, you stop volunteering distortions. When you stop trying to be indispensable, you stop obscuring the truth of how things actually function. I also began paying attention to timing, when reviews happened, when contracts are renewed, when decisions were rushed through at quarter end. These rhythms weren't secrets. They were just ignored by people too busy performing urgency to notice structure. I didn't share any of this. Not with colleagues, not with friends. Not even with myself in declarative terms. I wasn't plotting an exit. I wasn't planning a confrontation. I was preparing for clarity, and clarity doesn't need an audience. From the outside, I was still the same Maya. Calm, dependable, unbothered. Inside, though, I had stepped out of the emotional fog that keeps people compliant. I wasn't angry. I wasn't hopeful. I was informed. That's the part organizations often miss. They watch for rebellion. They listen for complaints. They brace for drama. They don't notice the person who grows quieter and more precise at the same time, because that person isn't reacting anymore, she's positioning. And once positioning is complete, the outcome stops being negotiable, long before anyone realizes a decision has already been made. The reveal didn't feel like triumph. There was no rush of adrenaline, no sense of victory. It felt almost mundane, like finally finding a document you'd assumed was missing, only to realize it had been there the whole time. I was reviewing dates, quietly, methodically, lining up performance cycles with organizational changes. I wasn't looking for leverage. I was looking for coherence, trying to understand how certain decisions had been justified retroactively. That's when something didn't line up. A timeline shifted by a few weeks. A responsibility reassigned without documentation. A meeting reference that never included me, despite directly affecting my role. Individually, none of it mattered. Collectively, it formed a picture that was unstable. I went back to my notebook, compared entries, cross-referenced emails, checked policy language again, this time slower, more carefully. And that's when I saw it. The organization's own procedures contradicted the narrative they were quietly constructing. Not overtly, subtly, in the kind of way that only matters if someone notices. There was an assumption embedded in how my role was being discussed, one that hadn't been formally acknowledged. An assumption about timing, about consent, about when certain decisions were made versus when they were documented. I didn't feel satisfaction, I felt stillness, because clarity when it arrives isn't loud, it's grounding. I realized then that the system relied on something very specific. My silence extending backward in time. My agreement is being assumed retroactively. My absence from conversations is being treated as consent. That's a fragile structure. The reveal wasn't that someone had done something outrageous, it was that the organization was quietly counting on the fact that I wouldn't challenge the order of events, that I wouldn't question how the story was being dated, framed, and finalized. And they were right about the past version of me. I sat with that knowledge for a long time before doing anything with it. Days, not hours. I didn't rush to interpret it as wrongdoing. I didn't dramatize it. I simply let it settle. Because once you see where the leverage actually is, you don't need to use it immediately. You just need to stop acting as if you don't have it. I continued working as usual, responding, delivering, observing. The difference was internal. I now understand that the balance of power wasn't where I'd been taught to look. It wasn't in titles, visibility, or approval. It was in sequence, in documentation, in timing. The organization had moved quickly, assuming continuity. I had moved slowly, assuming nothing. That difference mattered. I didn't celebrate the reveal because it wasn't about winning. It was about alignment, about realizing that my integrity, my insistence on factual accuracy, placed me outside a story that required ambiguity to function. That's a lonely realization, but it's also clarifying. From that point on, I knew one thing with certainty. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be reactive. It would be chosen. And once chosen, it would not be reversible, not because I wanted control, but because I was finally acting in full possession of the facts. The decision hadn't been made yet, but the conditions for it were now complete. And when conditions are complete, the outcome stops being a question of if, only when. Once the conditions were complete, the question stopped being what happened and became what I was willing to accept. That's a different kind of question. It doesn't ask for justification. It asks for alignment. I laid out my options the way I lay out everything else, calmly, without narrative. I could stay, continue delivering, quietly correct the record when it mattered, hope that accuracy would eventually be rewarded. This option required patience and faith in a system that had already shown me its limits. I could confront, request a meeting, lay out the discrepancies, ask for acknowledgement, adjustment, or repair. This option required emotional labor and a willingness to argue about intent instead of outcome. Or I could choose something else entirely, something irreversible, something that didn't ask the organization to change, but acknowledge that it wouldn't. That third option was the hardest to look at, not because it was risky, but because it was final. I thought about timing, about what it would mean to disengage from a role that had become fused with my identity, about how quietly I wanted this chapter to end. I wasn't interested in making a point. I was interested in not being rewritten. The decision didn't come in a rush. It came after a week of ordinary days, meetings, emails, deliverables. I watched how often assumptions were made on my behalf, how frequently my past silence was used to justify present actions. And I understood something essential. If I stayed, the story would continue without my consent. If I confronted, the story would become about tone and misunderstanding. If I left on my terms, the story would have to account for facts. That's when I decided. Not emotionally, administratively. I chose the option that didn't require persuasion. I didn't announce it. I didn't hint. I began preparing the mechanics quietly, reviewing notice requirements, confirming dates, ensuring my documentation was complete and internally consistent. I wasn't planning an exit that scorched anything. I was planning one that left no ambiguity. The decision felt clean, not empowering in a cinematic way, just aligned, like finally setting something down that I'd been carrying out of habit. I remember thinking, briefly, they won't see this coming, and then correcting myself. It didn't matter whether they saw it coming. What mattered was that once it happened, there would be no room to reinterpret it. I wasn't choosing absence as leverage. I was choosing accuracy as a boundary. There's a quiet confidence that comes from deciding without needing approval, without needing witnesses. The decision existed fully before anyone else knew it did. By the time I returned to my desk the next morning, the path forward was already closed behind me. Not with drama, with intention. All that remained was execution. And execution, as they'd always known, was something I was very good at. Execution didn't look like secrecy. It looked like normalcy. That was the advantage. No sudden changes, no emotional signals, just a series of small, correct actions that aligned with policy, timing, and fact. I confirmed my employment terms one last time, not skimming, reading as if I were an outsider. I noted notice periods, effective dates, and definitions that were often treated as flexible, but weren't. Words matter when they're written down, especially when someone later wants to move them. I organized my documentation into something coherent, chronological, and boring. That was intentional. Boring documents are hard to argue with. No commentary, no interpretation, just sequences. I also began transitioning knowledge, but only what was formally requested. No extra context, no anticipatory handoffs. If someone asked how something worked, I explained it clearly. If they didn't, I didn't fill the silence. This wasn't withholding, it was alignment. At the same time, I stopped absorbing uncertainty. When instructions were vague, I asked for clarification in writing. When expectations shifted, I asked when the change took effect. Neutral questions, unemotional tone, the kind that sound cooperative but quietly anchor reality. No one objected. Why would they? Everything I was doing looked reasonable, helpful, even. What they didn't notice was how much of the organization's stability had relied on my informal adjustments. Without them, things still functioned, but less smoothly. Deadlines needed renegotiation. Decisions required follow-up. People began looping each other in more frequently. It registered as friction, not threat. I booked a flight during this period, personal, long overdue. I didn't mention it beyond marking my calendar as out of office. The timing mattered to me, though not for the reasons they would later assume. When the day came, I wrapped up my work the way I always had. Clean inbox, updated files, clear handoffs, nothing unfinished. I left my desk the same way I'd arrived years earlier, quietly competent. At the airport, I turned my phone off before boarding. Not dramatically, just practically. I had nothing urgent to respond to. I took my seat, opened a book, and let the plane lift without me tethered to anyone else's expectations. While I was in the air, things continued without me. That was always the assumption, that I was interchangeable in the short term, that nothing hinged on my presence. What no one accounted for was timing. Sometime during that flight, a resignation email was sent. From my account, dated, logged, processed. I didn't know yet, but I had already done everything necessary for what came next. Because moving in silence isn't about disappearing. It's about ensuring that when something changes, it changes cleanly, without requiring explanation, negotiation, or emotional cleanup. By the time the plane landed, the sequence had begun. And sequences, once started, don't care about intent. They care about records. I landed on a phone that felt heavier than it should have. Not buzzing, not urgent, just heavier, like something had shifted its center of gravity. I didn't turn it on right away. I took my time, collected my bag, stepped into the terminal. When I finally powered it up, there were messages. Not many, but enough. A missed call from my manager, a short email from HR, a calendar notification was removed. The subject line of the HR email was neutral, administrative, the kind of phrasing that pretends nothing emotional has happened. Confirmation of resignation. I read it once, then again, slowly. According to the email, my resignation had been received, processed, and accepted. The effective date was listed as several days earlier, backdated, neatly, as if the decision had been made in the past, not while I was 30,000 feet in the air with my phone powered off. There was a brief note thanking me for my contributions, a line about next steps, and an attachment outlining final pay details, details that looked different from what they should have. That's when the consequences began. Not loudly, not chaotically, but unmistakably. My first reaction wasn't panic, it was recognition. So this is the version they chose. By backdating the resignation, they weren't just closing a chapter, they were rewriting its ending, adjusting timelines to avoid obligations that would have been triggered by a different sequence of events. Severance, notice, accountability. It was efficient, procedural, and fragile. I didn't respond immediately. There was no benefit to speed. I reread the documents, compared dates, cross-checked with my own records. Everything I needed was already there, quietly waiting. Meanwhile, the organization began to feel the absence they hadn't prepared for. Questions surfaced that no one knew how to answer quickly. Files were harder to locate. Context was missing, not because I'd hidden anything, but because no one had realized how much lived outside formal structures. I heard this later, secondhand. At the time, I was still invisible, officially gone, administratively resolved. My manager called again that evening. I let it go to voicemail. His message was careful, confused. He said there must have been a misunderstanding, that HR had acted quickly, that we should talk. I listened without emotion, not because I was cold, but because I was clear. They felt consequences before they felt concern. That order mattered. What they were experiencing wasn't punishment, it was exposure. The exposure of how much had been assumed, how many shortcuts had relied on my quiet continuity. And still, I said nothing. Silence at this point wasn't avoidance. It was respect for process. If they were going to formalize a story without me, I was going to let it complete itself before responding. By the next morning, the tone shifted. Messages became more frequent, less certain. Someone asked if I'd received the confirmation. Another asked if I could forward documentation that already existed, if they knew where to look. They were beginning to feel the shape of the gap. Not yet the implications, just the inconvenience. And inconvenience is often the first signal that something deeper has been miscalculated. I didn't feel vindicated, I felt steady, because the consequences unfolding weren't the result of a clever move. They were the natural outcome of a system that had mistaken my silence for consent, and my presence for permanence. Now the system had to account for absence, and it didn't know how to do that cleanly. By the third day, the tone changed completely. What had started as polite confusion turned into something closer to urgency, still controlled, still professional, but threaded with a pressure that hadn't been there before. Emails arrived framed as check-ins. Calls came labeled quick sync. Messages included phrases like just to clarify and want to make sure we're aligned. Alignment. That word always shows up when things have already slipped. They had begun to realize that the timeline they'd formalized didn't hold up under scrutiny. That backdating a resignation doesn't just adjust payroll, it rearranges responsibility. Projects suddenly had no clear owner. Decisions made after my departure had, in reality, depended on my involvement. The story they'd written required my cooperation, and they no longer had it. HR reached out, this time with more detail. They wanted to walk through the sequence together. They suggested a call to clear up any misunderstandings. The phrasing was careful, but the intent was transparent. They needed me back inside the narrative long enough to smooth it out. That door was closed. Not because I refused to speak, but because there was nothing to clarify. The facts were already clear. Any conversation now would be about optics, not accuracy. About minimizing exposure, not correcting the record. My manager's messages shifted too. He was apologetic now. Said he hadn't realized how things looked. Said the resignation timing must have been an administrative error. Said he valued my work and didn't want it to end this way. I believed he meant it. That didn't change anything. Regret when it arrives this late isn't a solution. It's a reaction to a consequence. What they were asking for, implicitly, was flexibility. A willingness to reinterpret dates. to retroactively agree, to help them restore coherence to a version of events that no longer matched reality. That's when I understood something fully. If I engaged now, I would be helping them fix a problem they had created by assuming I wouldn't object. So I didn't fix it. I responded once, briefly, in writing. I acknowledged receipt of their messages. I stated that I was reviewing the documentation provided. I said I would respond when appropriate. Nothing more. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't ignored. It was heavy, because now they knew it meant something. Inside the organization, things tightened. People double-checked approvals. Meetings were postponed. Someone realized that a decision they thought was covered wasn't. Too late. They couldn't undo the resignation without admitting it hadn't been sent when they claimed. They couldn't adjust the dates without reopening obligations they'd tried to avoid. And they couldn't pressure me without creating a record of exactly what they didn't want examined. Every path forward carries cost, and that's when panic sets in. Not loud, not emotional, but procedural. When every option exposes something you hoped would stay buried. I watched it unfold from a distance, not with satisfaction, with a kind of sober calm. This was no longer personal, it was structural. They weren't losing me. They were losing the ability to pretend they hadn't. By the time they realized there was no version of this that ended neatly, the window for repair had closed. Not because I slammed it shut, but because they waited too long to notice it was open at all. And once timing is lost, no amount of goodwill can buy it back. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't look like one. There was no raised voice, no defensive posture, no emotional escalation. Just a scheduled call, a neutral subject line, a handful of people on the line who all understood in different ways that this wasn't a conversation they could steer. I joined on time, camera off, voice steady. They opened with appreciation. That familiar language, measured, careful, almost tender. Years of contribution. Institutional knowledge. Regret that things had become unclear. I listened without interrupting. Let the words finish themselves. Then they asked me to share my understanding of the situation. I didn't narrate. I didn't argue. I didn't correct the tone. I stated facts, dates, sequences, the order in which things had occurred according to records they already had. I referenced emails without attaching emotion to them. I mentioned the flight. The phone is off. The resignation email was sent while I was unreachable. I paused after each point, not for effect, for accuracy. No one interrupted me. When I finished, there was silence. Not awkward, just dense. The kind of silence that follows when the story you've been telling yourself can no longer be maintained out loud. Someone said there had been a misunderstanding. I said I agreed, about where the misunderstanding began. Another suggested intent mattered. I said intent doesn't change sequence. HR asked what resolution I was seeking. That was the moment when heat could have entered, where I could have asked for apologies, acknowledgments, compensation framed as a repair. I didn't. I said I was seeking alignment with documented reality, nothing more. That answer unsettled them more than anger would have, because alignment with reality leaves very little room to maneuver. It doesn't negotiate. It just sits there waiting to be recognized. They asked if I'd be open to discussing alternatives. I said alternatives require shared premises, and we didn't have those anymore. Not after the record had been formalized without me. I wasn't cold. I was courteous. I thanked them for the call. I acknowledged the difficulty of the situation. I said I trusted they would proceed in accordance with policy. And then I ended the call. No threats, no ultimatums, no victory lap. Afterward, I felt something unexpected. Not relief, not triumph, but a deep, quiet ease. The kind that comes when you no longer need to manage how you're perceived. When your words are sufficient because they're accurate, not persuasive. The confrontation didn't change the outcome. It clarified it, for them, for me. They could no longer pretend there had been consent where there hadn't. They could no longer adjust the story without acknowledging the adjustment. The system had reached its limit, not because I pushed, but because I stopped compensating. That was the quiet dominance of it. Not control over them, but sovereignty over myself. I didn't leave the call wondering what I should have said. I didn't replay it in my head. There was nothing unresolved. Because when confrontation happens without heat, it doesn't burn anything down. It just illuminates what was already there. I don't introduce myself the same way anymore, not because I'm hiding what happened, but because it no longer defines me. What defines me now is quieter than a title and sturdier than a role. For a while after everything ended, I expected to feel hollow. Work had taken up so much of my identity that I assumed its absence would leave a vacuum. It didn't. What was left was space. And space, I learned, can be surprisingly instructive. I noticed how my body felt without the low-grade tension I'd normalized for years. How my thoughts moved without constantly scanning for problems that weren't mine to solve. How my time, actual hours, stretched when I stopped donating them to systems that never accounted for the cost. I'm still competent, still observant, still someone who values precision. But those traits no longer orbit someone else's priorities. They belong to me again. The most significant change isn't external, it's internal permission. I no longer confuse being agreeable with being ethical. I no longer assume silence is the higher road by default. Silence is a tool now, one I choose or set down consciously. I've also become more honest with myself about ambition. Not the performative kind, the kind that knows what it wants and doesn't apologize for wanting it. I'm careful now about where I invest my steadiness, my patience, my depth. Not everything deserves them. I don't feel bitterness toward the people involved. That surprises some listeners when I say it. But bitterness requires attachment to a different outcome. I don't have that anymore. The outcome was clarifying. What I do feel is respect for my past self, who survived by adapting, and for my present self, who no longer needs to. There's a confidence that comes from knowing you didn't win by outmaneuvering someone. You simply stopped allowing yourself to be misrepresented. That kind of confidence doesn't seek validation. It doesn't need to announce itself. If anything, I'm more selective now. With work, with language, with people who confuse convenience with loyalty. I ask better questions. I listen for what isn't being said. And when something feels off, I don't rush to smooth it over. I let it speak. The experience didn't harden me, it refined me. I understand now that systems rarely change because someone is patient enough. They change because someone becomes precise enough to stop absorbing their distortions. Who I am now isn't louder, isn't angrier, isn't more impressive on paper. But I am harder to misplace, harder to rewrite, and completely uninterested in proving my value to people who only recognize it when it's gone. That's not dominance in the way movies portray it. It's something quieter, something permanent. And once you know what that feels like, you don't rush back into rooms that require you to disappear in order to belong. There's a simple lesson people often want from stories like this. A clean moral, a rule they can apply. Always speak up. Never trust HR. Document everything. Those aren't wrong, but they're incomplete. What this experience taught me is quieter and harder to package. Integrity isn't loud, and power doesn't always announce itself when it shifts. Sometimes the most decisive moment is the one where you stop correcting other people's assumptions about your availability, your tolerance, your consent. I didn't win because I outplayed anyone. I didn't win at all if we're using the language of competition. What I did was refuse to participate in a version of events that required my erasure. I chose accuracy over accommodation. And accuracy, when maintained consistently, has consequences. If you take anything from this, let it be this. Watch how systems treat the people who make things easy. Not celebrated, not spotlighted, just easy. Over time, ease gets mistaken for consent. Reliability gets mistaken for agreement. Silence gets mistaken for absence. And when that happens, the burden quietly shifts onto the very people least equipped, or least willing, to carry it forever. You don't need to become confrontational to protect yourself. You don't need to harden your voice or sharpen your edges. You just need to notice when your silence is being used to rewrite reality and decide whether you're willing to let that continue. The moment I stopped absorbing distortions, the system had to face itself. Not because I forced it to, but because there was nothing left to hide behind. If you're in a situation right now where things feel slightly off but not bad enough to name, I hope this gives you permission to trust that instinct. Discomfort doesn't have to be dramatic to be meaningful. Sometimes it's just information waiting to be acknowledged. I'm not asking you to take sides. I'm not asking you to share outrage. I'm asking something simpler and maybe more useful. Have you ever realized in hindsight that your silence was being used to tell a story you never agreed to? And if so, what did you do when you finally saw it?